get some motion sickness, so I hop around. So we're going to talk about, well, to start off about me. Like Sean said, I'm president of the North Houston .NET user group. I'm from Houston, obviously. I was a founder of the Houston Give Camp, and various and that things around Houston. I actually used to live in Dallas. I lived here for about 8 years, and moved to DC for a couple of years, and then I've been in Houston for about 5 or 6 years now. So it's nice to be back and to get reminded of how god-awful the roads are here. Houston traffic is bad, but the roads they like make it compass roads. They're all laid out, geometrically. They make sense. Whereas in Dallas, it's just, like spaghetti. Every which way there's a major freeway intersection. I was trying to get here, and both of my map apps on my phone were telling me the wrong thing. And it's one of those, occasions where you really should have just put in the map app ahead of time. But I didn't think to do that, so I'm glad I made it here in time. I think Sean was getting nervous. Yeah. Sir. But onto the discussion. We're going to do a little bit of talking, a little bit of slides, and hopefully spend most of the time coding, because nothing is more nerve-wracking than coding in front of a room full of 50 people. It's like you code by yourself, you're fine, you're a master, you're a code ninja. One person looking over your shoulder, you become like 10 IQ points slower for every person staring at you while you code. So having 50 people look at me while I code will be just a great ego builder for me, I think. But I think that's will be a lot more interesting for y'all than just talking through it in the slide deck. This is the third time I've done this presentation, like in the past 2 months, and I'm about to do it again coming up for Houston Tech Fest in another few weeks. So on the one hand, you think that means I have everything ironed out and there's no bugs or errors whatsoever, no mistakes, but that's probably not going to happen. I'm probably going to screw up a lot, so just bear with me. How many of y'all are familiar with Xamarin already? Wow, how many of y'all are actually using it actively? Okay, that's really good. That's changed a lot in the past year or 2 years. The number of people who had even heard of it was still pretty low. So for some of y'all, this might be sort of regurgitation of some things you don't know. Hopefully, you'll maybe learn some things regurgitation of things you do know, but hopefully you'll learn some new things. So this is a scenario that I think is really common, and this is sort of where where I want to start from. You're a development manager, you're an IT manager, you're a project lead, whatever. You have a team of devs, and they're .NET guys, and presumably most everyone here has a .NET background. Is that sort of fair to think? Or is it like a room full of Java people and I'm already lost? Okay. I'll make a lot of Java jokes. And so you have a team, and they're .NET guys. And everything you do is .NET. You maintain your website in .NET. You maintain your desktop applications in .NET. You write your services in .NET. So it's very much a .NET environment. And your boss, the CEO, comes in and says, "Well, I was, reading the In-Flight magazine this weekend, coming back from my golf trip, and it was talking all about how awesome mobile is, and we need a mobile app, and I want it next week, I want it next month, I want it, in a embarrassingly short period of time, and I want you to cover all the major mobile platforms. So I want iOS, I want Android, I want WinPhone." And if he says BlackBerry, you just laugh at him and say, "No, I can't do that." But that's three completely different platforms he wants to target. And you have a team of .NET guys who already have their plates full with other projects and keeping the company alive and running and keeping the IT infrastructure running. So, how do you approach that? What do you do? And one option is you cross-train your existing team. They're 100% maxed out, so they won't mind learning some new stuff and taking on some new projects. You make them learn Objective-C, you make them learn Java. You hire a new team of developers. You know, your CEO is behind you on this. He wants it, so he gives you money. He says, hire some new guys. Get some new guys who already know Java, already know Objective-C. Or you could just, outsource it. Go overseas. Go find a consulting company who'd be more than happy to take your money to write an app for you in every platform you need. And those are all completely legitimate options that people choose, and they're, those are things you have to consider. But there's obvious downsides to that, and one is that you now have, if it's anything beyond just a very simple app, if it has any depth at all to it, it's going to have business logic in it, and domain logic that's now spread across your web app, your desktop app, your services, and then 3 different mobile platforms. Okay, who wants to maintain that? Who wants to do that in a way that's even remotely bug-free? I don't see any hands. And your development team, they all hate you. Because no matter what you chose wrong. You force them to learn a language they don't really want to learn. They're .NET guys. They're happy in C#. C#'s a great language. They don't necessarily want to have to learn and remember Objective-C or learn and remember Java. Or you hired a whole bunch of new guys, and the new guys all get to work on mobile stuff, which is cool. And they're stuck maintaining a website that's, 6 years old and clunking along, and the new guys are over there doing all the cool stuff in mobile. Or even worse, and this is the worst case, you go and you outsource the project. And, no one likes to see their company start outsourcing projects, because that means, A, it's going to go badly, and then it's going to land in your lap eventually to have to, revive it, do project CPR on it to get it working again. Or it's going to go well, at least from the financial point of view, and then they're going to start wanting to outsource all their projects, and there goes your job. So, you're rocking a hard place. No matter what choice you make, your developers are not going to be happy with you. And so what's the alternate? Is there an alternative way to approach this that saves you from those 3 nightmare scenarios? Yes, sir. That's right. Write an HTML app, do PhoneGap, and all your problems go away, because nothing's better than writing a very complex domain, deep domain application in JavaScript and HTML. That's a great language for maintaining complex business logic on a mobile device. But I don't want to be too dismissive of that. There is merit in that approach, but I don't think it's for a project of any size or depth. I don't think that's necessarily what you want to choose.
Okay, that is kind of an issue, because the HTML guys say they're the future, one place, everywhere, across the web.
Right.
At this point, my experience is it doesn't work that well. Easily do better stuff on the desktop.
Right. And I do think that you can do a lot of cool stuff with HTML5, but I don't think the adoption is very broad or deep yet. I don't think I don't know if the browsers. I don't know if enough has happened with it to really shake out all the bugs to make that a really great, viable choice right now.
They've got great demos, but putting all those pieces together in one app, you're going, okay, I got this problem, I got that problem. It can't be done as
right.
Reasonable time.
Right, and I personally have no idea of I can imagine, but I don't honestly know the enormous complexity that goes into a modern browser. But I assume that it's the engine that drives that is a huge hulking beast of very well written but complex software, and layering on top of that, maybe not the best choice.
The other thing is, like, if you're using like CSS to style your app to try to look like iOS or whatever, then they go and release a new version of iOS that looks different.
Right. All right, and we'll get to that. That's a good point that we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you have questions, feel free to shout them out at me, yell at me, throw things at me. I have 3 kids. I'm used to getting yelled at a lot. It doesn't bother me. But back to our sort of dream/nightmare scenario here. what if you can take all the existing C# knowledge that you have, that your team has, and you can leverage that to this completely new platform and not have to outsource it, not have to hire a whole new team, not have to do this enormous amount of cross-training. That to me sounds like a very, very attractive choice. And it's something that you can do cross-platform. You can do it, obviously, you can do it on Windows Phone 8. You can also do it with iOS and with Android. Again, BlackBerry, out of luck. And, like I said, without having to entertain any of those nightmare scenarios that will make your programmers, cut your brake line, before you leave work one day. But, I mean, just to walk it back a little bit, this is not a rainbows and unicorns scenario where everything's perfect and it's, boom, no work involved. I mean, there is effort involved in doing this, and it's not a zero cost approach, but it is, I think, a very much more cost-effective in terms of resources and time and money than the others we talked about. And there's my skeptical baby, what you talking about? When I started doing presentations about Monotouch back when it was actually Monotouch, when it was still in beta, and this is sort of the initial reaction you get from people. That is, come on, there's no way that can work. There's no way you can write a C# program, run it on a Steve Jobs device, and have it be performant. And that was sort of the first hurdle you had to overcome, was just convincing people that it did work and it worked really well. It's not so much a problem anymore because, like a lot of y'all raised your hands earlier, you're familiar with it, you've heard of it. It's not a completely new idea to you. So, on to the solution we're talking about, which is Xamarin, is a company that has taken the .NET runtime and the C# language and written bindings to allow you to run code written in C# and leverage the .NET framework and use it on these different platforms. You can use it on Android, you can use it on iOS, and then you can, of course, use it natively on Windows. And if you're writing well-architected apps, you can do share code across all the different platforms. You can write data and domain and business logic and services that can be shared across all the different platforms without not necessarily having to rewrite them. Of course, that assumes that you're doing well-written code and you have a domain layer and a services layer, and it's not just all one huge ball of wax, like we all do sometimes, even though we know we shouldn't. And the parts of the code that are platform-dependent, things that talk to the camera, things that talk to the actual device, talk to the gyroscope in this accelerometer, and talk to the what SMS service, and talk to the user through the UI, those parts are still native. You're not writing an HTML shim that's approximating a native user interface for your users. And that's like someone mentioned earlier, obviously after yesterday's announcement by Apple, we're about a week away from the new release of iOS. I can't remember the exact date, but iOS 7 is going to go to a general release next week. And if you haven't seen it, from a UI perspective, it's a drastic change from everything that's gone before it in iOS land. And if you're one of these companies that's written an HTML interface for their iPhone app, and it works great, I mean, that's wonderful. But when iOS 7 comes out, your app is not going to look like an iOS 7 app. It's going to look like it did before. And maybe that's not a concern for you, but for your users, they're going to get this. They're going to download iOS 7. They're going to put it on their phone. It's going to have this bright, shiny new interface, and they're going to load up your app, and it's going to look like it always did. They're going to think, well, that's not great. I mean, what's wrong with this app? Whereas if you'd written it with native UIKit elements, it would automatically get the benefit of having the new UI theme, whatever you want to call it, applied to it, without you having to do necessarily any work at all. And the same sort of thing with Android too. As Android goes through successive generations, its UI elements change. And if you're not using native UI, you're not getting the benefit of those changes over time. And I want to kind of, like I said before, it's not, unicorns and rainbows. I want to kind of set the stage and be sure we're clear, because I think I see a lot of people on the message boards and on Stack Overflow, they get they download the trial and they have these misconceptions about what Xamarin is and isn't. And I want to kind of be sure we clear the air about some of those first. And primarily, if you're doing iOS development for iPhone or for iPad, Xamarin does not allow you to not have a Mac. They do not bypass the requirement that you have to have an Apple machine. You can code on Visual Studio if you buy the appropriate license, but you still have to have a Mac acting as a build server. Or you can do like I do, and you can code natively on the Mac using their IDE, and it works great. But for iOS development, you still have to have a Mac somewhere in your build pipeline. It does not automatically port your app for you to all the different UI platforms. If you have, I seriously have seen people ask, well, I have a Windows Form app, and I want to port it. Will Xamarin do it for me? Xamarin will help you. I mean, it will help you do that process, but it's not going to solve the problem for you, and it's certainly not going to rewrite your UI from a desktop UI to a mobile UI. You're going to have to spend some time and effort and thought and code to get that to work. And it's not the Java solution of write once and run it everywhere badly. It is very, as a core part of I think Xamarin's philosophy about how they approach this is that they want the app to look like a native app. They want it to be a native app for each platform. They want it to have native UI and native behavior. Your user should not know that it was written with a third-party toolkit. It should be completely invisible to them, unless you choose to make it obvious. So, and you cannot just arbitrarily use any .NET code. That from if you have an existing WinForms app, you can't just grab any .NET assembly from it and expect it to work on the iPhone. There's limits to what parts of the framework are supported. There are restrictions just due to licensing, some due to just complexity of hardware support. Some are just design decisions that not every single thing will work, particularly if you're calling them 32 libraries. The .NET framework that exists in Xamarin is not a complete port of everything that exists in Windows. It's the .NET layer mapped onto the native hardware. It does not have Win32 system calls, so that sort of stuff is absolutely not going to work. And there are other things that may not work. And they give you tools to help you kind of determine where those stress points might be, and how portable your code is. Okay. Now we get to the really possibly embarrassing part of it, where I write code and y'all stare at me. So before we get too much deeper, any more questions? Anything you want to discuss first?
So this is more than, well, it's along the lines of, say, TK or Wix, but it's more.
Yes. It's not just...
Not TK. Because TK is actually a graphic library. It's like SWT Swing.
Yeah.
Or anything else.
It very much actually is not like TK, because it's not a unified graphical toolkit.
It's basically just a binding onto their existing APIs.
It's a binding onto the native APIs, so you can use the language that you already know, C#, and it also brings all the .NET Framework runtime, so you can do generic collections, and you can do link, and you can do all the string manipulation that you're used to, and you can do async. They just introduced support for that. Don't ask me to show you, because I can't. I personally have not done anything with it yet. And Link. I mean, Link is awesome. And we'll use that in the demo. When I very first started to write an iOS app, I actually took a class up here in Dallas with Objective-C, and I got a prototype working for my boss and showed it to him, and it worked. And I was really proud of myself. But my level of confidence in the code was just like that high. I mean, I've been a .NET guy for like 10 years or so, and I was not comfortable at all writing code in Objective-C. And this was before they even had some of the automatic reference counting, so the memory management was a lot more complex back then. And one of the things I wrote was I was trying to consume data from a web service that was giving me XML, and I kid you not, I mean, to write an XML parser was like at least 50 lines of code, if not more, and it was complex and it worked, but again, I had no confidence in it. And doing it with Xamarin, with Monotouch, even at the time when it was still in beta, it was literally one link statement. Just suck in some XML and populate some domain objects with it. So I just can't imagine leaving that behind. And I know guys who are, were hardcore .NET guys who made the jump to doing Objective-C full time, and they're very, very happy, and they, are writing great apps, and more power to them. But I personally found that a very difficult transition to make. And I think, like I laid out in the scenario at the beginning, if you're primarily, even if you're writing mobile apps and you can do it in Objective-C, if you're working in any sort of corporate environment or even a small company, you still have a lot of other code you have to support. So it's not just a question of switching to Objective-C, it's a question of doing that and also doing all the other stuff you still have to do every day and that your team has to do. So, you ideally want to do it in a way that leverages as much as possible what you already know. So we're going to go in here and there is, and it's kind of complex. Originally they supported it was basically it was .NET 2.0 based on the Silverlight profile minus some stuff that did not, like the UI stuff that obviously did not make sense for them. They've now gone as far as the current version support .NET 4.5 minus some stuff, and I couldn't tell you exactly what all. I mean, some of it is the obvious stuff like the UI layers and some of the database stuff is not there. But
most of the system component model's not there.
Yeah.
WCF is there, but pretty much just basics if you do EWS star stuff. It's not there.
Yeah,
You have to have the enterprise license too, right?
There's a few things that you get at the business or enterprise level, but it's not that much. There's some better database support with the higher level license. There's also some restrictions on the iOS side because Apple does not allow code generation on the device, so everything has to be compiled ahead of time. Which, for the most, in my experience, is really not a problem. But there are some situations you get into. There's some link statements you can write where the compiler just cannot figure it out and will blow up. It'll work on the simulator, but you try to deploy it to your device, it'll blow up because you can't figure out the header. The Xamarin model is AOT, which is ahead of time compilation, where it's sort of the traditional back to your root C, method of compiling everything, linking everything into a single assembly for deployment. So there's a few caveats there that are different. Some limits on reflection, what you can do with it, mainly dealing with code generation. And the story is a little bit different on the iOS side versus the Android side because Android does allow code generation, does allow just-in-time or more just-in-time compilation than iOS does.
Can you repeat the questions?
Okay, I'll try to. I did this last time I did a demo. I downloaded an update right before I did the demo, and that was a horrible, horrible idea. So we're just going to close that and not download that update. Bad things will happen. So this is Xamarin Studio. This is Xamarin's native IDE that they've written. It's available on both Windows and Mac. This is the tool you would use to write code. There's also an option if you buy one of their higher level licenses where you can write code using Visual Studio. If you like Visual Studio, and who doesn't? It's a great tool. And But like I said, if you're doing iOS development with Visual Studio, you still have to have a Mac act as a build host or a build server. On the Android side, obviously, you can do it completely in the Mac, completely in the PC. It doesn't care. But we're gonna. Yes, sir.
Are there any great advantages of having that Visual Studio? Obviously, use that as great. But you really have a decent debugger and things on the actual studio.
The question is there an advantage to doing it with Visual Studio versus Xamarin Studio? I personally use Xamarin Studio. I found it to be very effective. I like it. I actually have not tried the Visual Studio approach. I think the main advantage for Visual Studio, or there's a couple. I mean, if you're obviously you have a lot of time invested in learning how Visual Studio works, so you're going to be more productive in Visual Studio. You're going to get the benefit of using external tools like ReSharper. That all those sort of productivity tools that you can use with Visual Studio will still work with Xamarin. They will not work in Xamarin Studio. If you're if you're maintaining a large code base, lots of different projects, it's switching back and forth between your Mac and a PC may be a considerable cost. So sticking with just Visual Studio may be beneficial to you. I personally just use Xamarin Studio. I like having it on my Mac. I think it definitely is not as polished as I don't know how many editions of Visual Studio we're in now, but it doesn't have that much polish and that level of feature set. But it also doesn't. My experience using Visual Studio is that 75% of those menus, I have no idea what they do. I don't use them. All those. Yeah. Right. It's cheaper, and there's so much extra stuff built into Visual Studio, which is, I think, most of us do not utilize a great amount of it in our day-to-day work. Maybe some of us do. I don't think I have. But we're going to use Xamarin Studio here. We're going to open a new solution. It uses the same solution and project file structure that Visual Studio does. So the projects are interchangeable back and forth. We're going to create a iPhone project, an empty project, and we're going to call it Socks. And the reason we're going to call it Socks is I assume everyone here knows what Stack Overflow is. Yes, please tell me you do. Okay. So we're going to, Stack Overflow has a data API. We're going to use that as a basis for writing a little Stack Overflow client, Stack Overflow Explorer Socks, or Stack Overflow Xamarin Socks, depending on how you feel about it. Sir?
What version of Visual Studio project solution file does it support?
I think it works with 2010 or 2012, I think.
2013 will work for you to monkey pack some stuff.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I got it working at one point in time for iOS, but it broke Android. So.
Yeah, it's basically 2010 or above, I think, is the cutoff. So we've got a new solution, a new blank solution we just created in Xamarin Studio, and to prove to you that it works, we're going to launch the simulator and watch the magic happen. I was always excited the first time. It's kind of slow launch. It really needs to be built into it. There's the iOS simulator, and it looks like it's not doing anything, but it's actually running our app. And our app doesn't do anything yet. It's just a blank screen, so that's our app. Another, I guess, a good point to make about this is that this right here is Apple. That's part of the Xcode development tools that you get with your Mac for free. This is not a Xamarin product, so you're using, when you're testing your code, you're writing it in Xamarin and then you're launching it in Apple's simulator. So Xamarin does not build or support the simulator. Apple does that.
So then what happens if you're working on Windows targeting iOS?
Then you have to either pop open your Mac or use remote desktop or whatever. That's one of the drawbacks. That's another drawback of the Visual Studio approach, is that you have to either deploy it to a device to test or run the simulator via some external mechanism. Yeah, so the simulator does not run on Windows. Apple does not support that. And this is the Retina version of the simulator. There's also we can switch it to the old school version, and you can let's see if our app. Yeah, there's our SOX app right there. Again, does nothing. It's blank. So we're going to take it from here and build an actual functioning app out of this. We're going to try to. Can I make my font bigger? I could try to make my font bigger.
That's one advantage of Visual Studio right there.
So I think you have to go to preferences.
Zoom out, zoom in.
Yeah.
Yep.
Apple
Plus.
Yeah, I don't want to be.
Yeah, text editor.
Well, let me try the Apple Plus. See what that does. Where's the name plus key at? I'm not sure.
No, I don't think there's a hotkey for it.
Okay. Dun, dun, dun. So fonts, text editor.
Go back to where it says default.
Yeah. Okay, I hope I remember to put that back when I actually go back to coding again. Is that better?
Everybody see it?
Okay. So we're going to go back to our solution, and generally, let's talk about this real quick. As I walk away from my phone. But I mean, this is an iPhone project, but all of y'all, if y'all know C#, can look at this and read it and have a vague idea of what it's doing. It's got namespaces, it's got public partial classes, it's got, public methods with arguments, it's got the using statements, it's got the solution explorer over here, solution pad, which is very similar to the solution explorer you'll find in Visual Studio. I'll pop that open in a minute, you'll see the layout of the project. But this should be 75, if not 90% familiar to you. You can read this, you have an idea what it's doing, even if you don't know anything about iOS. You would not feel the same level of comfort if you looked at a project in Xcode. You would, feel the shiver up your spine and your stomach would drop. If we look at the project here, we'll see it's got references to system libraries. It's got a list. It's got resources. It has a list of source files. So very familiar to us. So we're going to write a semi-well architected app. We're going to have a separate domain layer. And we're going to have a separate services layer. Oops.
So you just created an iOS library project.
Mm-hmm.
Intuitively, I would think that the notion of a library project would be shared, whether it was iOS or...
You would intuitively think that. You would be wrong.
So you can, but it's a class library.
Let me talk about that a little bit. I don't want to get too deep into the woods there, but the traditional. How many people have heard of portable class libraries? That's pretty good. The traditional library project model in C# and .NET are single targeted. So it's targeted at a specific version of the framework at a specific device. They're not portable. As we get more and more mobile and we try to do more code sharing, that becomes a problem. So Microsoft, it was Microsoft, came up with the idea of this portable class library, which is basically a DLL that's multi-targeted, where you can say, I want a DLL to support Android and Windows Phone 8 and whatever. And it's going to figure out what the least common denominator amongst those different platforms are and give you a library that only supports those elements of the framework. Scott Hanselman had a really good write-up on PCLs a while back. Might even be like a year ago. If you're not familiar with it, you want to read that. He's written some good stuff about it. I think in the pretty recent past, the support on the Microsoft side for PCLs has gotten a lot better. On the Xamarin side, it's still kind of weak. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you do code sharing with Xamarin. PCL is hopefully where we're moving towards, but we're not there yet. So we have a domain layer, a services layer, and then our main UI platform layer, which is as good, relatively good separation of concerns, at least for the amount of time we're going to spend here. So we can try running this again, and it's probably not going to run because it did run. Hey, it didn't used to do that. It used to complain if I had library projects that didn't have a code in them. I know why it didn't. Probably because I didn't set up my references yet. Now it's going to complain because I have nothing to compile, which is actually, I'm not sure if Visual Studio does that. That may be a Xamarin thing. So just to make that happy, we're going to add some files. In services, we're going to add and in our domain, we're going to add class. So we run it now. Should build. And there's our blank app again. How exciting. So let's go ahead and make the app actually look like it's going to do something, so we can tell that it's working and not just a black screen. So let's add some classes here. I'm going to add a view controller, which is I don't want to get too deep into this, but it's a very common element, a paradigm, whatever you want to call it, you use in iOS development, whether you're on Xamarin or doing it natively. You have table view controllers. Sort of. I find Apple's take on MVC to not really mesh well with the sort of traditional ASP.NET MVC, but I don't know if that's just me or other people feel that way. Apple does, and if you look at their documents, their architecture, they do think of it as MVC. I just don't. It seems a little off to me. A question view controller that's going to, and we're going to, in our app delegate, which is sort of our master, kind of our global ASCX type thing. If you're coming from an ASP.NET background, we're going to So let's see if this runs, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we did. So So there's our question view controller. It's, again, empty because we haven't done anything yet, but you can kind of vaguely see there's really faint grid lines there between the rows of the table. If you've ever used an iOS device, even if you don't know anything about the underlying code paradigm, table view controller is your mail app, your contacts app, anything that's got that single column grid of data, which is all over the place because you can't really do any other kind of grid on a device that's got that small of a screen. But it's everywhere, particularly on the iPhone. So it's a very common thing you'll use. And how you create one is to use a table view controller, which is what we did, and we didn't put any data in it, so it's not doing anything yet. But basically, in our app delegate, we created one. We assigned it to the root view of the window of our device, and that's what's showing up on the screen. So to make that actually do something a little more useful, let's go and extend it, give it some data. So a table view in iOS, just like, and let me back up a little bit too. And this is another a good illustration of another maybe common misconception about iOS or Xamarin. If you're doing iOS development with Xamarin, you don't need to know Objective-C, but you do need to understand Apple's view of the platform. And because Xamarin is a very one-to-one-ish mapping of Apple's class library, Apple's class hierarchy into .NET. A few modifications here and there, but it follows pretty closely to how Apple does things. So you really need to understand the Apple approach. And the same thing on the Android side. If you're doing Android development in Xamarin, you need to understand actions and fragments and I can't remember all the other things that go on in Android, but activities. Those sorts of concepts, they still apply even if you're using the Xamarin tools. So you still have to understand the underlying nature of the framework.
OS actually have the status bar up here and these don't have.
Yeah. It's just like doing web development. It doesn't matter what language you're using to do web development. You still need to understand the HTTP post and get model and all that sort of stuff. The language matters, but you still have to understand the underlying architecture of what you're developing on top of. You're not freed from that.
Well, your caution there sounds like you could wind up with separate code bases for these devices.
Well, again, that's where you're dealing with the platform. So if you're writing, you're going to have to write separate code bases for the platform-specific parts of it. The stuff that you're doing is just purely data and domain and services. If you do it right, it should be agnostic to the platform, and you should be able to reuse it. So in our question view controller, we're going to create a class. That inherits from and up here in our we create a question and let's build it. It's not going to build. Oh, well, that's one thing I shouldn't. But there's some abstract methods in the table view source that I need to override to make question source work. Tell it how to actually draw a cell when it wants to put some data on the screen. We need to tell it sections are in the table and how many rows of data there are. So for now, let's create data. And, well, so down here we want to say number of sections. A table view can be grouped. So there's multiple sections, and each section has rows within it. For our purposes, we're just going to say it. And for a number of rows, we're going to say it has, oh, come on. Never done that before. It's, okay. So for rows in a section, we're going to say it's going to be, we have one section, so this is going to be our data. And then for actually drawing the cell, we're just going to return the string from our data list. And we run it. It should build. Should run. Oh, it thinks I have. It's waiting for me to connect the device. So let's not do that. Woo! Data. Yay! I said I'm done. Thank you. There are days when if that much works, you know, that's a win. You should just quit. But we're going to try to take it a little bit further so we can actually demonstrate some code reuse. So let's go into our item class, and we're going to create a. Again, the idea here is we're going to get data from Stack Flow. It's going to have a type. It's going to have a what else did we put in there? Oh, it's going to have a set of tags associated with it, although I suspect we're not. So that's our domain layer right there. Really simple domain layer, which I wish they were all like that. And then our service layer, we're going to create a method to actually go and get our data. And this is where this is where the power of LAMP.
And we need to add a reference back to our domain layer so you can return the right kind of object. And what we're going to, one other thing we're going to do, because I like to cheat if at all possible when I do demos. We're going to go, I already have some JSON here we're going to add to the project, just so we don't have to worry about dealing with actual network traffic and weirdness that comes from that. So in our get questions method, we're going to go grab the data. In our project as a JSON file. We could search it. As a functionally should work the same as if we got it off the network, but people, you don't want to do things like that. Here's another something to demonstrate from Xamarin. Xamarin has a component store, which is fairly similar to the idea of NuGet with Visual Studio, and it's basically a list of package components for all the different platforms that some are free, some are provided by Xamarin, some are provided by third parties, some are commercial that you can get to use in your project. So we have this JSON.NET project or library we're going to use. Out there, called by the in front of you. That's right. You're laughing at my jokes. Come on, give me I drove like 4 hours to get here. Give me a little, a little bone. And use LINQ. Does anyone not use LINQ? I started a new job recently, and there's very, very little LINQ in their code base, and I see stuff written. And LINQ's been around for 3, 4, 5 years now at least. So it freaks me out that they're not making better use of it.
Is the around the issue with I know it checks to see what references you use.
Yeah.
Can you change the settings to help with that? I know there's
it's not so much the settings. There are some tricks you can use to when you run into one of those things where LINQ kind of barfs on your code. Some of them you can just. Some of it is because when it links the LINK links, it tries to strip out all the parts of the framework you're not using. Yeah, sometimes if you're using in LINQ statements, the way the references work, it's not always obvious that you're referencing a certain class. So there's some things you can do to kind of force the compiler to recognize that you're using a certain class and not to strip it out. Sometimes you can just rewrite your statement a little bit to make it a little, I guess, more obvious to the compiler what's going on, and it will figure it out. I've never personally run into a problem where I could not get around it. And you see questions on Stack Overflow and on the forums from people who are having problems with it, and there's usually is a workaround. And there are some really obscure compiler flags and things you can do too to work around some problems, and I almost never have to get into those, thankfully. So from our JSON file. We're going to set the title. Let's just build that to see what happens. Oh. So. Yeah. So that built, it's not going to do anything yet because we haven't done anything with that service. So we'll go back over here to our view controller and our data source, and instead of making up data, we'll go into we'll say data. And we'll run it. Pray, cross our fingers. Oh, what's wrong now? Oh. It's actually grabbing data from our file, from our engineering service. It's getting data from Stack Overflow, populating our table view with real data, and displaying on screen. And we can do table viewy things like we can scroll up and down and watch it repaint. So is that vaguely clear to everyone what we did there? We have a domain layer, we have a service layer, we have our UI layer. We built our table view, we got the data from our service, we got a collection of our domain objects from our service, and we populated our UI element with them. So pretty basic stuff, but on a completely new platform. Question?
I had a couple of questions on the UI part of. I know I went through a bunch of all the new stuff for like Windows Store apps, and, RT versus full-blown Windows data, and also Windows only apps. There's a bunch of little nuances. I mean, it all boils down to XAML, but there's a lot of neat little features within them. How much of that is supported? Would you go native with that?
None of that's going to be supported. Well, I don't know all the specifics, but generally speaking, none of that's going to be supported. So, I mean, that's the case where you're going to have to have separate code for your UI layer on all the platforms to take best advantage of each platform. And because of Windows Phone 8 app, just the navigation, the way it flows is very different from the iOS approach. And I'm not very familiar with Android, but I mean very different from the Android approach too. So you really do need to have that customized for each platform.
iFactor and iCareability have some approaches to try and get some amount of reuse in the UI.
Yeah, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. There are some other kind of third-party projects going on to allow more flexibility and more reuse at the UI layer. Now, I do know people who have, I've talked to in Houston, big companies who are putting a lot of effort into having HTML front ends just to avoid that problem. And I think they consider it worth the cost for them to be able to get the apps out faster. And these are, some of these are corporate apps, so they're not going to be public facing, so they don't care so much about the native UI experience. But I mean, that is something some people do. I don't think it's a great approach, but it's valid.
On each platform, there's like flavors of HTML5 that are different on all.
Yeah, and I just think, I mean, it seems like it's a lot of work to sim in that to HTML5, to the glue to connect your UI to your back end, and it's just never going to be a great experience for the user, in my view. So, where are we on time? Oh, we're trucking along. So let me go ahead and jump over to the Windows side of things and show you all kind of how code sharing can possibly work between the platforms. So, let's see. Let's see if this is going to work. Have to shift everything around because the cable's not long enough to fit everywhere it needs to go. Okay. So, and then we need to turn on Hangout, right? Okay. Okay, so here we are back in Windows 8, Visual Studio 2012, kind of what we're used to. Should look very familiar. We're not going to walk through building this from scratch again because that would just be too painful for all of us. But I have basically the same project written in Windows Phone 8. It should run. I did this demo 2 or 3 weeks ago when I shut the Windows laptop, and I haven't opened it since until I got here tonight. So it should be the exact state of it. It's not. It's there it is.
Is that really how Windows 20 runs?
I work Microsoft. So that's our same basic app. It's got our set of questions. And it actually has a little more data. It's got tags in there. But the same project. And if we look at the code, we'll see we have the same project structure. We have a main SOX project. We have a SOX domain. We have a SOX services. And the SOX, the naming is a little different, but that's just because I wrote these at 2 different points in time. Functionally, they're the identical code. We have a domain class. We have a services class. This is a very simple demonstrating approach you can take. I can, and when I first did this, I did. It's just sort of bifurcated over time, but share the exact same class code, source code between the 2 different projects. So I could, if in my repository in Subversion or TFS or whatever I'm using, if it supports linking, I can create a domain project for Windows Phone 8. I create a domain project for iOS, and put the same source file in both of them. And that source file will then get used in both projects. So the same code is being used. It has a slightly different container because the project files are not compatible for multi-targeting between devices. So I can share the code. It takes a little bit of work to do it, but I can functionally do that. And so if I had a complex domain class, I could set it up, share the code between the projects,
complex services class, whatever, data layer, and share it between the projects and have them both use the same source code so that when I build, I check in, I make changes, I fix bugs, I check in to my repository, my auto build, my continuous integration runs, and it builds for both platforms, and both platforms then get the fix. So, and that's, I think, as of today, that's sort of the official Xamarin recommended approach to doing it. Moving forward, as PCL support gets better for portable class libraries, you should be able to do it with just one project file used in both solutions, which will be a lot simpler for maintenance, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And on the subject of portable class libraries, you have to keep in mind that it's going for the lowest common denominator amongst the platforms that you pick. And when I first wrote this demo, I actually had a funny situation occur where I wrote the iOS version first, and I was actually doing a network call instead of using local data. And it worked great, and I copied it over to the Windows Phone and Visual Studio, and I ran it, and it wouldn't work. Heck, I mean, it's like 6 lines of code. It's not that much going on there. And what happened is that on Windows Phone 8, all your network calls are async. You cannot do a blocking network call. So what I was doing on the iOS side, just for laziness because of the demo, was I was just doing a blocking network call to get the data from Stack Overflow and download it, and that worked great. But on Windows Phone 8, it would not let me use that approach. So I had to modify, and that's kind of when I did the fallback to just using local data because I didn't want to get into writing async calls in a demo because that's guaranteed to end badly. But that's kind of a funny illustration because you'd think Windows has broader support than iOS for the .NET library, but that's a situation that I didn't. And you might run into others where one platform supports two. You're targeting 3 platforms. 2 of them support one version of a method call, and the third one supports an older version. So you have to go with the older version. Things like that you'll run into. There's a tool that Xamarin has. If I could find it, we'll try. Oh, come on. Scan, there it is. This thing they call their mobility scanner, what they came out with a few months ago, which is pretty awesome. And basically what it does is you upload a DLL to it, it looks at the DLL, and it basically tells you, this DLL is great, you're not doing anything that's going to break on any platform, or this DLL is using a method call it's supported on 2 platforms but not the third one, or what have you. Or you're doing something that's just completely insane, you have a bunch of Win32 calls, you're out of luck across the board. And I guess we can try it.
Of course, there's no cleaning of code, right?
No,
Cleaning?
Miguel answered that question. That's wrong. They don't upload the DLL. It actually scans the whole thing.
Yeah, I've never dug into it to look to see what it's doing.
Most of it will not upload their code to a random third party for either course compatibility.
Yeah,
unless they're required to.
So I don't know exactly what it's doing locally, but if they say so, I trust Miguel. But
I swore he said it was Silverlight, but he might have been making a joke at that time.
yeah, I would be kind of surprised. So we'll.
I'd be weird to see if they parse binary and stuff like that.
I have a hard time seeing how that would work, but so we're gonna what? Oh.
Change the filter in case it calls something.
No, it's there. It is. So let's upload our domain DLL, and we're going to check it across the 4 different platforms they scan for are Windows Phone, Windows Store, Android, and iOS, and
How much of this demo would run in the starter version?
everything, I think. We'll talk about the versions in a minute. Oops, what's it going to say? Oh, come on. We're 100% compliant, which is what we expected, because we wrote this with the idea that it would be cross-platform, and granted, there's like 3 lines of code in this library, so it would be really hard to make it not cross-platform. But we get 4 bananas. Xamarin's a very monkey-centric company, and it does things. You can download it. It will store it. You can create an account, and it will store it for you. So if you're scanning dozens of libraries, you can manages the history for you. And if we were doing something, I guess we can try doing a different
component model from.
Yeah. No. But basically, I mean, if it does fail, it gives you pretty detailed a listing of what the calls you're doing that are failing across your library. So it's pretty useful. So if you're in the situation where you've got a lot of legacy code that you want to know how reusable it's going to be across platform, this is a good start to give you an idea. And and what this isn't going to tell you though is, I mean, even if your code is structurally reusable, you might have a big fat domain library that's 5 meg. Is that really something you want to share with a mobile app? And the compiler will strip out the stuff that's not getting used, but there are considerations beyond just compatibility. You have to think about the size of the download and what you might be getting by with code on your desktop app, which is really inefficient, but it's got this huge desktop processor that's got 4 gig of RAM, and who cares if it takes a couple extra cycles? But when you port it to a mobile device, that's different. It's a different, even though it's a very powerful computer, it's a different spec, and you need to think about resource limitations that don't exist on a desktop or don't exist on a big powerful web server. You need to consider those when you're doing a mobile app. You also need I talked earlier about people asking about porting desktop apps to the phone, and just apart from the usability and real estate considerations, there's also kind of the use case scenario where if someone's sitting down at your desktop app or your web app, they're sitting at their desk and they're going to go in your app and they're going to use your app for 5 or 10 minutes or an hour, or I sit there. I use Visual Studio and Chrome all day long. On my phone, I pull my phone out of my pocket, I wake it up, I look at my mail for 5 seconds, and I put it back in my pocket. The scenarios in which you use a phone and the way you use even the way I use mail on the desktop versus the way I use mail on my phone is different, and you need to think about that. And I think particularly that a lot of people, I think a lot of people with existing apps think that, well, I want my app to run mobile, but I want it to support everything. And when I first started doing mobile development at one of my prior jobs, there was very much the mindset of, well, if the mobile app doesn't support everything that the desktop or the web app does, then clients aren't going to use it, or they're going to think it's crippled or whatever. And that's just, it's a wrong way of thinking, and it's dangerous because, it's just the way people use apps are different, and their expectations are different, and it's just a different paradigm, and you have to think that through in terms of everything, use cases and UX and resource usage and all the limitations placed on you by sandboxing versus not having sandbox apps. So obviously this is a group of mobile developers, so this is stuff y'all probably have all faced before, but that's an argument I think we're going to be having for a long time, because we still, I think all of us have arguments with people about they want the web app to do things that just don't make sense in the webs. The web's been there for 10 plus years, so going forward with mobile, we're going to still face that battle. Well, they want the mobile app to do things that just don't make sense for a mobile app, and you need to think that through. That's pretty much the presentation. Let me think of a couple more points I want to make before we go back to questions. One thing that gets asked a lot, and it's hard, I can't give a quantitative answer for it, but it's the question of performance. People say, well, there has to be performance hits. How bad is it? And my sort of stock answer is that I've never seen a problem. There may be one. I don't know of hard numbers comparing native versus the Xamarin approach to say what the number is, but I've never seen a performance problem with the Xamarin app that I would consider noticeable to user or noticeable, measurable at all. There are certainly very performant applications out there that are written in Xamarin. There's a game platform called Unity 3D, which you can write games with it. If you look at Xamarin has a showcase somewhere on their website where they showcase some of the apps that are written with their tools. So there's some very performant 3D games written on top of Xamarin. There's a guy named Frank Krueger who wrote a program called iCircuit, which I guess was originally like an open source Java circuit simulator for electrical engineers, and he ported it to the iPad using Xamarin. And this is a complex piece of software. It's doing some really wicked stuff, and it runs great. And on the way up here today, I was actually listening to a Hanselman podcast that he did just a week or two ago with Frank Krueger. Frank Krueger has a new app called Calca. Calca, is that it? Yeah. I haven't actually downloaded it yet, but I've looked at the website, and it's basically sort of this Mathematica type expression of calculator where you just type in stuff and it just on the fly calculates things. I guess we could look at it. I'm just talking about it. Let's see if it. So it's basically this just huge IDE type text editor where you just type in mathematical stuff and it just evaluates it on the fly and does all this really complex. And in this conversation he was having with Scott Hanselman, he was talking about doing these 3D matrix calculations, and he was using language that was way over my head. And it was 100% written C#. And he was, incredibly happy with the approach he'd taken. It runs on iPad and iPhone, and he actually he wrote it originally for iPad, and then he said he discovered after he'd written it that he had a lot of requests from financial customers who wanted to run it on Windows. And so he said he ported it to Windows, and this is what he said. Assuming he's telling the truth. He said he spent 3 hours taking the code, and basically he said the engine basically ported over like with one change required, and then he spent like 3 hours writing a little UI on top of it for Windows XP, and that was all it was required. So I'm assuming he's probably a much smarter programmer than I am, considering the kind of things he's doing. But still, I think that's a good testament to the kind of code reuse you can get out of it. And that's another question people ask a lot about is what's the percentage of code reuse you can have? And of course the answer is it depends. What are you doing? I mean, do you have a really complex app that has 90 screens of data entry? Well, that's going to take some time. If it's a simpler app where and actually probably the more complex your app is, I would hazard to guess that maybe the greater the percentage that is under the covers, and that's the data, the domain, and the services, the things that can be ported, and there's probably less on the surface. Whereas you're writing a very simple brochureware type app, it's kind of not very deep. Most of it's going to live in the UI layer, and you're going to not be able to port that across. So I've heard a lot of people say 90% they think is a good number. I talked to a guy recently who had done an Android and iOS app, but he felt it was a lot lower. He was doing a lot of mapping stuff, which was more at the UI level, so he didn't think he got as much anywhere near that number. He was more like 60%. But it's going to vary depending on what your scenario is. And we sort of hinted at earlier, talking about some alternative approaches to doing that. There's at least 2 different projects out there that are kind of designed to be MVVM type architectures that run in the Xamarin space. One I believe is called Monocross, and there's another one called MVVM Cross. I think one's a fork of the other, one's a little newer than the other. I haven't used either of them, but there's actually a presentation coming up at Houston Tech Fest, and a guy's going to do a presentation on MVVM Cross. So I'm really interested to see, how he utilizes it and what how that helps code reuse. And one of the conceptual things it's supposed to do is allow you to it abstracts some of the UI layer out. So you could write the UI layer and have the engine sort of render it for you, in the appropriate way for each platform. And I'm probably not doing a good explanation of that, but that's the idea. So it's not completely separating you from the need to write custom UI, but it's kind of helping you leverage some, some commonality out from that problem. And Xamarin actually provides some tools along those lines. They have a library that comes with their products called Xamarin.mobile, and it basically takes platform-specific functions like camera, GPS, contacts, and something else. I don't remember what it was, but things like that are different for each platform. But and Xamarin.mobile basically provides a common API for you to interface with that on each platform. So basically, you code against their common API, and then it figures out all the differences for each platform for you. And there are some other tools that they provide that kind of above and beyond just the mapping of the underlying frameworks. There's on the iOS side, there's something called monotouch.dialog, which is basically sort of a functional way for you to build table views and data entry forms without having to manually code up table views the way we did in this example. And there are some other things, things within the code base where they basically have sort of they mimic the Apple way of doing things with with how they handle delegates and how they handle data sources. But they sometimes also provide a third way, which is a little more of a C#.net-ish, kind of way of approaching things to make it easier, for those of us who are coming from that background. I would be hard pressed to come up with more than 1 or 2 examples right now, but there are some in there where they kind of they've gone a step beyond just the mapping of what Apple does. They provide some extras.
Using Mono over a year ago, I started dabbling with it. All the examples I was seeing, they looked like you jumped over to Xcode and could lay out the UI and basically then jump back in. I never got really far with it, but
right.
In your demo, you didn't choose to do it that way. And what's the benefit versus just hand coding kind of what you did?
Okay. So backing up, the question is in writing UI using Apple's tools versus writing it in code, the way I was doing it. You certainly can in Xamarin write it. In the Apple world, there's their native IDE, Xcode, basically has a component called Interface Builder, which is sort of the design surface that we'd be used to in Visual Studio, where you can drag and drop XAML or HTML or whatever to visually build code, visually build UI. And you can do that approach where you can open up you can basically from within Xamarin Studio, you can double click on something and it will open up Xcode, you design your file, and then it creates basically creates a code behind file for you in Xamarin Studio. I don't do that for a couple of reasons. I don't like Xcode. it's much better than it used to be, but because visually it's a very complex piece of software. It's a little bit like, for me, like opening up Photoshop to try to edit 4 pixels in a picture. It's like it takes me hours to do it. Whereas if I open up Paint.net or Paint, I can do it really easily. It's such a complex tool, and it does so much that it's so easy to get lost. And then the interaction between Xamarin Studio and Xcode is sometimes very wonky because Apple did not design Xcode as something to be integrated with a third-party tool. It's not like Visual Studio, where Visual Studio is full of hooks for third-party people to write things for. Well, Microsoft fights that. Apple does not. So from that point of view, it's hard. I find it difficult to work with. Just in terms of doing demos with it, this is not a bad projector, but most of the times I can't assume I'm going to have a nice high-res projector, and if I open up Xcode, no one can tell what's going on because it's so much stuff on the screen, and it's shoved in this little window. And honestly, for me as a developer, I mean, when I write HTML, when I write XAML, when I do anything, I tend to write the markup by hand. I don't use drag and drop tools. I just don't. My experience has been most people don't. But I do know people who do it, with Xamarin, and it works great for them. So that's certainly a valid approach. There's also currently in alpha or beta right now a Xamarin design surface for iOS. So basically, from Xamarin Studio, you can open up a nib file, which is sort of their binary UI file, and edit it directly in Xamarin Studio with their built-in design surface, which is a very simplified, easier to use design surface that integrates much better with Xamarin Studio than using Xcode does. And that's something you can see in alpha right now, alpha or beta right now, and I don't know when it's going to actually officially launch. And again, I'm much more of an iOS guy, but on the Android side, I think you can basically do the same. I think Android UI is usually designed using their markup language. I can't remember what it's called. And I think you can use Android design tools to do it, or you can do it by hand. Either way, they both work. I don't know that one is any better than the other. So.
The downside to using interface builder is the files is they're binary. So if you check stuff in, sort of you're going to be blown away your zip file every time.
Yeah, it's true that
version of zip files.
The point he was making is that the interface builder files, the zib or nib files, are binary XML. So if you're putting them into source control, you're very unlikely to be able to get any meaningful history from them. So, or do diffs or anything like that.
Android's XML, so you can at least manage that.
Right. Any more questions, sir?
I guess, what are the like the versions of Android? How far back does it go in iOS?
iOS, I'm trying to remember when it first came out.
At one time.
Yeah, well, I don't know what
That's probably 3.
It's probably iOS 3. As far as how what devices they support, I mean, it's always kind of a complex story because you target for a specific device and then you can run it on older hardware. Or you target for a specific iOS version. You can run it on older versions. As long as you don't do anything that's not supported on an older version, you're okay. Or you have to wrap that in a version check, and then you get to the point of just how old is the device before it's so unperformant that you're not even running it. You can't even run anything on it anymore. I don't know what the official story about that is. My general take would be if it's capable of running the current version of iOS or the one generation behind, I wouldn't see any problem with that. If it's something out there still running iOS 5, you probably can make it work on that, but it's you're just going to have a problem supporting multiple platforms.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of usually corporations, especially coming from web background, it's like they're always browser compliance pretty far back because they have a wide array of user.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then IE10 is so vastly different too. We've seen a bunch of stuff right now.
Now it's even different in forward. It's about bring your own device. They don't
Right.
have it back to it. Look at Android. Look how fractured that is. Like, you make sure it runs like a Galaxy S3 and an S4 and a Nexus 4.
Yeah.
That's it's always going to be there. There's a piece of software that solved that problem. Well, that's it.
I found if you don't have a lot of platforms you have to support, you can go back pretty far. I mean, there's some old Windows CE, CF frameworks that I've seen Xamarin run on pretty well. Some of these older Win 6 and 6.5 and other devices that a lot of UPS and Targets and others are carrying around still. And so, and those are Xamarin C# I used to work for iCare Mobility, and they were doing a lot of work in that space. So it seems like if you've got a really specific platform, you're okay. But yeah, if you're trying to go from Compact Framework 6 to a weird Droid and an iOS, I mean, it starts getting tricky, like you said, with versions.
Yeah.
Blocking to get.
Yeah. And Xamarin, you know, the fragmentation problem, which is, you know, a huge problem in Android, and getting to be a slightly, you know, medium-sized problem in iOS is, you know, that's not significantly. You know, Xamarin has that issue just like you would if you're doing native development. You know, that's just a problem that everyone has to deal with or make their own decisions about. One thing Xamarin does have, and again, this is something that's in beta, that they introduced at their conference earlier this year is Xamarin Test Cloud, which is basically a UI test platform where you can upload Android and iOS builds to it, and you can tell it to, I want to test on these 20 different devices that, you know, run Android. I want to test on these 5 different, you know, types of iOS devices, and it allows you to either script your own test, or you can automatically run tests, and it will record them for you, and it'll tell you which devices crash at what point, and, you know, take screenshots and core dumps and help you, you know, help you alleviate the problem of having to have a drawer that has 95 different Android devices in it to test against, manually test against every time you do a build. So that's something that they're actively working on, and they're in beta now and to be released at some point in the future. That looks like, from the testing perspective, is going to make, I think, things a lot different, you know, for people who are hardcore mobile developers.
There's a webinar about it on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week.
Yeah, it's true.
It's called Calabash. Calabash is open source. If anyone wants to go actually do it on their own, they bought the company basically that produces Calabash and actually build the cloud, which will have many more devices, once again, than we could ever have.
Yeah.
If you got 20 devices and you want to automate it, Calabash, you can do Calabash right now.
Yep. It's more of it.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
I guess going towards the UI more, went to see Scott Hanselman at the last ASP.NET user group, and he showed, basically he was talking about how design mode is going away, and when you were actively debugging, you could run multiple emulators through Visual Studio 2013, and then you could actually edit in line in those emulators as well. So he was showing some crazy stuff in that. So I don't know how far Xamarin is.
Different browsers, nothing.
It was just browsers, right? So
Yeah, the browser linkers.
Yeah.
browser link, right? Okay, but then wouldn't you be able to do it for Windows Store apps as well?
No, that's a different.
Not Store apps. Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Because it's just like a little signal bar.
That's what I was. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. On the device emulator side of it, like because Xamarin is dependent on Xamarin is completely dependent on the emulator provided by platforms. So it uses Apple's suite of emulators. It uses the Android Nightmare emulator stack. So. Any more questions? Sir?
You ever worked with any third-party tools that are pretty high-end? Like one I know, the Schema T-Chart. It's like it's one we use in our Windows application.
Mm-hmm.
See that they adopted pretty early on Xamarin.
Yeah.
By chance of you that or anything at a kind of high-level UI that's robust.
I haven't. I've done some things like I've used some barcode scanning components that are through the component store. Used actually I wrote my own signature pad, which now is something you can get from the store. So, and there's a lot out there. I really haven't done a very good job of keeping up with all the stuff that people are putting out there. There's some themes out there. There's, a lot of utility type stuff. There's also there's some more commercial type stuff like Shinobi charts, which is a lot of fairly complex, expensive charting stuff. Which there's not a good way to do that now. It's to write it yourself. So that's an option. And that's that's a good point that I did not mention is there's a concept. Let's say that you find you're looking on Stack Overflow, you're trying to solve a problem, find a component, you find a great iOS native component, open source that you want to use in your project. Well, how do you do that? You could, open source, you could just convert it to C# yourself, which is a viable solution depending on what you want to do with it. But there's also this concept of binding, where basically you take the native DLL and you write C# bindings to wrap it, and then you can then talk to it directly from your C# code and utilize it, even though it's written in native Objective-C or native C, and which is basically the same approach that Xamarin takes to the Apple SDK. And Xamarin has a free tool called Objective Sharpie, which is basically just a little client app that you run, and you point it at a DLL or a library, whatever the SOs or whatever they're called in the Objective-C world.
Dilute.
What?
Dilute.
Dilute? Is that what they are?
DYLO.
Yeah, dynamic lives, I guess. Yeah, and it basically will generate a wrapper for you, which you then may or may not have to go tweak manually to get it to function. It's called Objective Sharpie. It's out there on Xamarin's website somewhere.
Would that iOS component then run on the side, or
it's still going to be it's going to be native to iOS, and and there's similar approach. I don't on the Android side to be able to take a Java library and wrap it.
It's called JNI.
Yeah, I'm not a Java guy. I don't know. I don't know what the tooling is like for that yet, or if you just have to hand code it. But there is an approach that works, so you can utilize native code for either platform and use it in your Xamarin projects. Uncomfortable silence falls across the room.
We have somebody on the. Sorry about that. We have somebody in the chat room who's asking if you can set up an Intel-based, Intel x86-based simulator for Android. I can give them some feedback on that, maybe if there's some documentation.
There is documentation on their website somewhere on how to get the Intel emulator work with Xamarin, and basically yes. The answer is yes. I mean, as far as I know, Xamarin can use any of the emulators that you can create through the Android emulator manager thingamajiggy. So, yeah, that is an option.
So learning more, I guess there's a free version of Xamarin that's downloaded the website.
Yeah. Whoops. Let me. Back to my slides, maybe. Yeah, I'll talk about licensing a little bit. Oh, come on. Oops. So, for more information, I mean, there's a couple of resources you can use. That's my email. Feel free to email me if you have questions, and I'll I'll help you out as best I can. Obviously, I don't care about the Houston Xamarin Users Group. Come to this user group, I'm sure there'll be more Xamarin content in the future. Xamarin.com is the place to go. They have a lot of documentation, a lot of samples. They have some really good, fairly mature, complex sample apps that are, Android, iOS, and Windows Phone cross-platform. They'll kind of demonstrate what I demonstrated, but to a much higher degree, kind of how you would architect a complex solution so that it would run cross-platform and maximize the amount of code sharing you can do. They have docs, tutorials, webinars, all sorts of stuff. Monolingual.net is my site, which is basically a kind of compendium of various resources and events and blogs and stuff. And I did the thing where it's been on my list for a long time to launch, and I finally did it. And I was so proud of myself that I finally got it done. I can mark it off my list. And of course, what you forget, or what you delude yourself into forgetting, is that you do that kind of thing, and then you have to keep it updated, populated with content. So I'm not doing a great job of that so far, but I will endeavor to do better in the future. Xamarin just launched something a week or two ago called planet.xamarin.com, which is sort of a blog roll of some of their MVP blogs and the Xamarin content from around the net. That's interesting. Stack Overflow is a great place to go for Xamarin content. You can see, ask questions, see what 90% of the time, if I have a problem and it's a known problem, I will find it addressed somewhere on Stack Overflow. A lot of the Xamarin team, is very active in responding to some of the common questions, and I'm on there a lot responding. Apple is a good resource if you're doing iOS development. A lot of times, if you look at the Xamarin docs, they're basically going to say, they're going to point you to Apple because it's the same class hierarchy, it's the same SDK, it's the same API. So it is to your benefit to get familiar with Apple's docs, learn to read them, and at least be able to kind of follow the code samples, even if you don't completely grok what's going on. Same thing with Android. If you're dealing with a platform issue, go to the platform API docs and look at them, and maybe you're passing in a wrong parameter, or this is a known bug, or it's some weird platform-specific sort of thing. So those are always a good place to turn. Licensing. Let's talk about that for a second. I'm not a Xamarin sales guy. I don't get any cut of anything they do, but just to maybe help explain it a little bit. I have this big, my screen is cracked on my laptop, so there's this big hole where I can't see anything, so I'm not sure if I'm clicking on the right link. So this is what the pricing tiers look like for Xamarin right now. It used to be different. In February, they relaunched with a completely new setup. There's a start tier which is free, which basically is for individual developers who want to learn about Xamarin, get your feet wet, try it out. That's what you want to do. It only supports Xamarin Studio, so not use Visual Studio. It doesn't have all the support for all the features, but kind of the key differentiator is the app size. There is a limit. I can't remember what it is, but it's in
30 kilobytes.
What is it?
30 kilobytes.
30K. The limit the size of your compiled app can be. And the way they determine that is basically they look at, how big your app is before they link it with framework. So it doesn't count framework size against you. It's only your code. But it also includes any non-core components that you might include in your app. So it's a significant limitation. I mean, it's a great way to learn about the platform, but for writing a production app, it's a significant limitation. So I hope maybe at some point in the future they'll change that limit. They'll be a little more friendlier to small devs, but again, they're a startup. They need to stay in business. They need to make money, so they can't give it away for free. There's questions like this that pop up on their forums. Microsoft has BizSpark, and they give everything to you for free. Microsoft is a $20 billion company, and they can afford to do stuff like that. That approach does not work for much smaller companies. The indie tier basically gets you everything except the business features. And I think the core thing about the business features are support for WCF, Visual Studio, SQL Client, which again, if you're writing a mobile app, you should not be writing directly against your SQL database. You should be writing against your web services. Do not, if you're writing a mobile app that's talking directly to your SQL database is on the web. That's a bad thing, and you should not do that. So,
Or you should be using SQLite.
yeah, SQLite. Well, even if using SQLite, you don't talk to your SQL database across the web. You talk to services. SQLite locally. So with the indie tier, you can't use SQL Client, you can't use WCF, and you can't do headless build. It's basically Visual Studio support. Business tier basically removes those restrictions and gives you Visual Studio support. And the enterprise tier is basically intended for if you want to do enterprise deployment with Apple, which basically means you want to deploy to people inside your organization without going to the App Store. That's what Apple considers enterprise. And Xamarin's Enterprise is what you need to support that model on the Apple side. So that's why that's there. That's for really deep pockets, I guess. As far as actually being able to deploy apps to the App Store, deploy apps to your device, you can do it with any tier. Even the indie tier, as long as you keep it to a manageable size. The pricing is per platform, so the iOS license and the Android license are different. They're exact same pricing, exact same tiers, but they're two separate licenses. And this also applies to, they have a Mac desktop product called Xamarin.Mac, which basically allows you to write C# apps for the Mac desktop. And there's a discount if you buy multiple licenses of some percentage. I don't remember what it is, like 15 or 20%. And this is an annual license, and then it renews at some percentage of what the cost is. And you get support and upgrades for free as long as your license is current.
Business upgrade is $250 a year.
Yeah.
They used to not have the business tier. They didn't have the business tier one.
Right.
They had the indie tier, which was lower price. Everyone who was in the indie tier got grandfathered into the business tier, where we have to pay the $250 a year.
Yeah. They used to not have any free tier. They also, all the editions, I believe, you have a 30-day free trial. So if you want to try out the Visual Studio support, you can do it for 30 days for free. And they have a student edition too, or a student license, which I think you have to email them about, prove that you're a student, and I don't know exactly what it does, but it's something. So, it's not free, but I think it's well worth the cost versus running Objective-C. And I'm running late. So any final questions before we wrap up? I'll be here for y'all want to come talk. We have stuff to give away too. I don't know how we're going to do that. That's Sean's problem to figure out.
I'm not sure we know.
It's still cage match.
Thank you. Jim. All right, so we did have a couple of giveaways. I think Sean's figured out how we're going to do that. So our meetings are going to be, keep me honest here, second Wednesday.
Second Wednesday is 6
p.m.
p.m.
6 p.m. We will not be meeting here next month. We're going to be meeting in Addison office. So anyways, we'll put that on the meetup. So just when you see it, don't immediately think the Microsoft building. We're going to be in Addison. So, we'll be at a good time. We'll send out some feedback information on meetup. So please be honest. This is the inaugural meeting, so we'd like to learn, get your feedback.
It will only get better from here.
Nowhere to go but
We set expectations as low as possible for
Well,
the
we
first
started with
meeting.
you, so it's
I
going
know.
to be a hard, it's a hard meeting.
But this is like the guy from Houston, so if they hate him, he'll be another hours away.
That's right. That's right. So anyways, so Michael's got a tough act to follow, I guess, next month, but I'm sure he'll do his best. So Michael's actually our speaker next month. So we'll look forward to seeing you next month and figure out how we're going to do gifts. And I'll carry or point or whatever you need.
We got everybody checked off, right? I went ahead and put numbers to everybody who's checked off. And we're going to have our speaker pick some random numbers
Okay.
out of his head.
Okay.
Or use a random number generator.
Okay. Well, actually, I have a raffle bot for NHD now. I don't know what the URL is, so I can't use it tonight. But I can show y'all how to find it.
If we can have between 1 and
34. Well,
1
let
and
me
34.
show off the stuff.
Okay. This is
So Jason brought us some nice shirts. There's 3 of them,
yes, I think.
and they're all extra large.
Whatever I grabbed. I've been bugging Xamarin for months about sending me swag because I had all these talks coming up. And it kept not happening. And finally, I got a package this week, so I have like 100 Xamarin C# shirts. They say Xamarin on the sleeve very subtly, and they say C# in huge letters, so you can proudly.
They're all extra large.
When you go out to they're getting rumbles with the Java people, you can wear your colors, like Sharks versus the Jets.
I would make sure you do it during a daylight meeting, not a evening meeting. They can be a little rough. So, all right.
So we need a number between 1 and 34 here. I'll
Okay.
get a handoff.
27.
27. That is.
Oh, it was Ulysses. Can I
Ulysses
give
Bear?
it to you, or must be present to win? That was my friend that came.
Must be present.
All right,
Right.
we can get another one.
12.
And that means all the online people
Now,
have to be
this guy
here.
does have triplets, and he didn't have a reason to leave.
Oh, no, I have twins. That's the reason not. Did y'all stop recording for my wife? Says that?
Go ahead with another number.
12.
12. That's LeBlanc.
Nope.
Did I say that right? Okay. I'm horrible with names. I'll warn you now.
33.
I have really my glasses on.
33. Okay, that's okay. Vishal?
Vishal Shram.
Woo!
There we go.
3.
3. Number 3, Cody Russell.
I actually work for Xamarin, so I'm going to.
And you're gonna pass?
I'm going to pass. I'll let it go to somebody else.
Okay.
And speaking of swag, I'm going to try to get some for next time. I didn't find out about this until kind of late, so I'll try to get some more swag next time.
We need swag.
9.
9. Jared Simpson.
Woo!
Yeah!
23.
Shane of Irving, no last name.
Shane?
Shane?
I'm sure it's not Sean.
Yes, I'm absolutely sure. It's not Sean.
31.
31. Okay, Mike Beatty.
Oh, come on. Y'all didn't all leave early.
I guess we should have told him to give stuff away. Oh well.
My random number distribution is probably a little poor. 11.
11. Justin.
Hey, Justin.
There's only one Justin.
There's only one.
All right, and then we've got a couple of Pluralsight. And is this from Xamarin too?
No, that's from Pluralsight. If y'all need swag, contact them. They have a user group thing where they'll send you like a huge package of cards for 1 month Pluralsight passes.
Yep, $29 value.
Do they have Xamarin?
They do have some Xamarin
All right,
content.
well, there you go. So.
Yep.
So,
They've
all
got
kinds of
what,
other
4 or
goodies.
5?
I have no idea.
All right, so got 2 of these.
9.
9. Where do you get that one?
I did.
You want a shirt?
Oh, I can't remember, man.
I'll be your runner.
28.
28. I'll go to the second page. Vance. Lee.
Ooh. And 14.
14. our final winner tonight, hopefully they're here. Mark Mad Lang.
Yeah,
Hey.
yeah, that's fine.
We have the mark card around. That's really correct.
Thanks, guys.
All right, well, that's it. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and please don't wander around the building, elevator down now.
Yeah, make sure you go down the elevator to the security guy. Get you. Everybody's good, though.